Morning, YouTube America. I'd like to continue speaking on one of the topics I brought up in my last video, World Building 101. A lot of new GMs and stuff, like I said before, find themselves at a challenge creating a background or an environment for their campaigns to run in. Uh, us more experienced ones usually have a lot to pull from, a small inventory of various previous campaigns that we can meld together, or we find and develop a particular world of our own preference where we've developed, the game world of our our dreams or our mind. Uh, one of my, excuse me, as I said, one of the there's a number of source books and stuff on the subject. I find that one of the better, well defined books, oddly enough, is the 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons uh, uh, DM manual. I'm sure a few of you have got these sitting on your shelves. You know, uh, this is one of my more favorite source books for use. When I point this out to newer GMs, guys who want to run the game world for on their own for their first time, I tell them that a lot of times it's easier just if you can afford it to go ahead and purchase one of those pre-existing world campaigns. Forgotten Realms is very popular for Dungeons and Dragons, uh, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's gobs and gobs of reference material, the novels, other game source books, so on. Makes it a little easy to do. You just grab it, pull out the shelf. It's like McDonald's. No matter where you go in the world, you know what a Big Mac's going to be. So that's what makes the comfort and familiarity of fast food so appealing to many people. No matter where you go in the world, you're going to find the same thing. So if you're mentioning, a particular subject material and background, and everybody's who's in your campaign is familiar with Forgotten Realms, you don't have to do a whole lot of legwork. And that's kind of the whole point of that stuff in the first place. And we're talking about creating our own. If you look at like I said, the guidebook, it breaks it down into two. They give you two suggestions. The building from the inside out. This is where you start with a small community or a small dungeon, and the immediate terrain around it. And the opposite of that is building from the outside in. This is where you've created a map, and a lot of people start with a map. Maps are easy, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. There's a reason why that's not necessarily a cliche thing to say. Having a map, J.R.R. Tolkien started with a map, according to the books I've read on the subject. I've decided I'm going to do this, and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to fill in the blanks. Uh, there's nothing wrong with doing it that way either. Sometimes finding a place in between works for most people. Myself, I like to start with, for most part, I'm building a world campaign where I'm going to play numerous campaigns over time in this setting. It's my own version of a specific environment, or world as it will. So, I like to have as much pertinent information as possible in backstory notes, mostly for myself. Fantasy and science fiction give us some opportunities that allow us to come up with some pretty creative environments and world development for our players to enjoy, as long as we don't or resist the urge to get overly complicated while floating castles in the sky and chunks of land that phase in and out are fantastic. Having a land that a section of a place that's inverted where land everything is upside down is exotic and even magical. It can become convoluted and complicated if you try to do that too much of that on too small of a playing field, if you will. A little bit of that goes a long way, by the way. You do not need a lot of that to make your world exotic. One of the concepts I learned early on was to look at my environment around me Doesn't matter where that is. That could be your backyard. It could be the driveway. It could be a pile of clothes over there in the corner next to your bed where you've been too lazy to pick up, and your wife's been nagging you for a week to, lease yourself. Uh, if you take it from a different perspective and you look at that and say, hey, that's an unusual terrain, ignore the coloration, or include that. I mean, that's part of the deal. I mean, I can look at a leaf-covered lawn and find myself envisioning a forested world of very strange exotic plants, or a planed, grassland that's speckled with very strange obstacles or exotic ecology or iconology or structures that the locals would take for granted. That's another thing to consider. Most of your players will find your new environment or your world exotic and unique, but their characters, on the other hand, traditionally grow up or live in this environment. They should not be overawed or shocked or surprised by the exotic subject material or environment that you've created. Finding that's where the part of the challenge of trying to come in and find a happy medium in between. Uh, like I said, I like the concepts that they use in 3.5. It's very basic. It's very simple. They call it the KISS system for a reason, and there's good reason for using that system, I believe. On the other hand, like I said, there's no problems with or no reason not to embellish or to expand on that as you wish. You know, it says here. Start with a small area and build outward. Don't even worry about the whole world look like or even the kingdom. Concentrate first on a single village or town, preferably with a dungeon or other adventure site nearby. Slowly expand as you go. This is one that's good when you're dealing with stuff on the fly. I've got a couple of people getting together for the weekend, and we're just going to have a couple game sessions, and maybe it'll go somewhere. I don't know. I'll whip down a couple of my maps and I'll look at this and I'll say, okay, here's your environment, here's your setting. We're not going to overly sweat about how the politics work or whose religion's in charge. Uh, where the train is now. In the more advanced settings, advanced players, this is stuff where I like to get into play because I find it the skill sets and knowledge in these more realistic environments and settings to be a challenge in and of themselves. I've had entire game sessions go where nobody drew a sword, nobody threw a fireball because it wasn't necessary. They were fighting the terrain or the environment or the weather. The weather can be a nasty and nifty tool for a GM. A nice blizzard coming out of nowhere can put a challenge on any group. Did you bring enough proper attire? Do you have the means to start a fire? Can you keep the fire going? Do you get lost in the blizzard? The list just goes on. And this is where the old system, some of these newer systems, the 4.0 butchered the skill tree as far as I'm concerned. Did not like that. I mean, well, I understood what the designers were going for. They were going for simplicity. They were narrowing down and saying, okay, well, this whole batch or category of skills all fall under the heading of this one specific type of skill. And so we'll just narrow it down to this, that, and the other thing. Well, the older system had numerous skills, and for good reason. Part of the challenge of a GM is to find creative ways to challenge the player characters, and using skill sets in appropriate places is part of that challenge. Which, ironically enough, if you think about it, we all have general skills that we take for granted. We all have things that we know how to do, or grandpa taught us how to do, or dad taught us how to do, or we have a hobby that sets us apart from a lot of our friends. We're better at this than they are. That gives us a better skill. I can have a whole session on skills, and we might do that at some point because I'm a big fan of skills. We talk about building 101. The second half of this is the outside in. This is where they say, start with a big picture, draw a map of the entire continent or portion thereof. Alternately, you could start with a grand design for how for how a number of kingdoms and nations interact or outline a vast empire. There's nothing wrong with that. Considering that I like to do that also, but that usually comes later. I want to know myself how the politics work and how things work. This goes with in my mind. It's how things actually develop. I've seen too many dungeon crawls, if you will, adventure campaigns where the GM is either lacking creativity or lacking the desire to look at things from a structured situation. Uh, Even in the wilderness, even in fantasy settings or science fiction settings, there's usually some order to what's going on. We don't generally find a dungeon except in very base or very junior game campaigns or very inexperienced GM's campaigns where we come into an environment where orcs and ooze and banshee and so on and so on and so on all inhabit the same, pretty much the same stretch of underground property. No offense, no, no, and no. Get over that urge to do that. That's one of the downfalls of a lot of these books. They give you a set of charts of suggested encounters that we roll random, and while there is a place and time for those things, creating and filling your dungeon or your setting up your adventure that way, well, it it just is wrong. I mean, no offense, but having a chromatic dragon and a lawful good dragon living in the same dungeon, even if they're 1,000 meters apart with 100 feet of rock between them, is never going to happen, even in a fantasy setting, unless some uber powerful entity is controlling them. And I've also played in a few of those kind of campaigns and dungeons where the GM is getting a laugh in the back of his head or back of her head by creating this uber powerful entity that's playing with the characters. I don't like that. Frankly, that's amateurish, and the appeal to it wears off fast, especially when there's no seeming reason or rhyme to this, whatever it is we're doing. Some uber powerful whatever pulled this group of people from random places, threw them together into this environment, just basically as to be their cat's paw. And that's you have to really like that sort of thing, I guess. I don't care for it. That's just personal preference. Building, like I said, building a good campaign or building a good world for your campaign setting doesn't have to be overly complicated, but it can be enjoyable. And as the book says, a lot of GMs, a lot of players find that to be a very appealing part of the game, is being able to create something uniquely your own or totally your own. And over time, those can develop into some pretty fantastic stuff. I've seen some really unique or really creative worlds over the decades. Yeah, decades. Yeah, truth is the truth. They didn't. Most of those GMs didn't just stumble on it overnight. This is something that they worked on over a long period of time through many campaigns and various players. This is something a GM puts a stamp on his or her style of play and carries it with them. If you're great with the McDonald's, then by all means buy the prepackaged stuff. Judges Guild's old stuff is awesome. I like it because it's easily modifiable for just about any fantasy game setting and a lot of science fiction settings for that matter. The World of Greyhawk is a classic. Like I said, Forgotten Realms is the big gorilla in the room. Most players of note, most gamers of significance is going to have a handful of those books on their shelves somewhere. I mean, come on. I've seen some of your videos, and I've seen the wall full of books in the background, and I have that too, except it's in boxes. Because it's hard to put a bookcase in the back of a Ford Focus. Working on that, at least temporarily anyway. It's a good thing to work on these things and keep it in perspective. Like I said, looking at your environment around you when you're developing your world is key to simplicity. Now, keeping it simple is is easier for you, them, and everybody else. But it's the foundation. It's the building stone of a very elaborate world over time. Because I don't know how many folks out here actually tried to sit down and write a novel. I ran across a formula one time, and it was either Writer's Digest or in somebody, maybe it was Kuhn's book on how to write books. Might not have been Kuhn's. No, Kuhn's, no offense, you're a hack. All your stuff's the same stuff just over and over and over again, and you hire, people to fill in the blanks for you. It's okay if you got the money and they're cranking those kind of books out, but makes them lame. You're not McDonald's. Stick with the Big Mac, my friend. Uh, anyway, the I lost track there. Thanks a lot, Koontz. I don't like your stuff anyway. By the way, no offense. The concept here of developing things that fill your world with and make it interesting over time is time. Straight up. Start simple, keep it small, work your way into it. Your characters, I don't know where it was, a lot of good characters in a lot of novels, oddly enough, did not start out with this elaborate, the writer didn't start out with this elaborate outline. Well, they may have actually, but suddenly there's a dynamic there, or the character in the novel takes on a life of their own, and they run off, and a good writer will let them go. Will let loose the tress and watch them soar and see where they go. We ride along with them, not forcing them to go where we want them to go. We kind of guide them, gently maneuvering them and setting up the environments that keep them in line, basically keep them in a straight line, because going in a straight line is the key to making a good campaign work. Most of your players, like some characters in some novels, have a tendency to want to veer off, change, do this, do that, or just sit here and spin in circles. Well, the challenge of a good GM is to be able to keep them moving in some form or another in the same direction, even if we're waving around or spinning in circles. Uh, there's some adventure challenge that. Door building should be the same way. I start out small. I start out with an overlying picture of an idea of how big or what I want the environment to look like, what the map from space might look like, so to speak. But I don't fill in all the blanks until we go along, because I allow this story to develop. Encounters that happen to player characters over time have and do influence the environment that they play in. That's kind of a basic thing that we want. It works. I mean, there's a reason why it's a basic tool. It works. The fact of the matter is, you allow your world to develop like you do characters, and you'll be richer for it. It's always a good thing to keep plugging away at that sort of stuff if you keep it in your mind. Well, I'm about running into my allotted time, and I know most of these videos don't tend to run too long. That's my rambling way of doing it. Bear with me. I think I have some more material and subject matters to talk about on the world building and more advanced concepts in mind. We'll talk about those at a later date. Meanwhile, you have yourselves a good and profitable day. Enjoy life. Enjoy the little things, because you never know when they're not going to be there.